Now I'll invite interested delegations to ask questions to the mandate holder and to make comments on the report. First on my list is European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union thanks the Special Rapporteur for her presentation and for all the work done during her mandate. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Eritrea and in particular by the lack of substantial progress on issues highlighted by Mrs. Ketarut's latest report, such as arbitrary arrests and detentions, freedoms of expression, association and assembly, freedom of religion or belief, and the continuing departure of Eritrean asylum seekers. We encourage Eritrea to expand and strengthen its engagement with international and regional actors on human rights. We reiterate our call to the government of Eritrea to cooperate fully with UN mechanisms, including by respecting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and granting full and unhindered access to the country. We urge Eritrea to put an end to all human rights violations and to take forward institutional and legal reforms to ensure the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and the rule of law, to implement the accepted UPR recommendations, to respect property rights, including those of foreign communities, and to end the indefinite compulsory military service. We welcome the recent declaration of the government of Ethiopia regarding the settlement of the border dispute. An enhanced dialogue between Asmara and Addis Ababa could positively impact on human rights promotion in the whole region. The European Union would like to ask a Special Rapporteur what her assessment is on the general trend regarding women's enjoyment of human rights in Eritrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Next on my list is Norway.
Mr. President, Norway would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her tireless efforts and final report to the Council. We regret that she has not been granted access to the country and invite Eritrea to cooperate with her successor. Recent news from Asmara to open a dialogue with Ethiopia is promising news. We hope this sets the stage for peace and normalization, which also should give positive impact on development and the human rights situation in Eritrea. As a long-standing friend of Eritrea, we remain concerned by the reports of grave human rights violations. Upholding human rights is an integral part of a government's duties towards its citizens. It is vital to ensure transparency as regards both process that has been made and areas where improvements are needed. In order to strengthen accountability and the implementation of human rights obligations, we urge Eritrea to allow experts from the UN access to the country. Cooperation with special procedures representatives is crucial to complement the UPR process. This session has a particular focus on women's rights. Norway recognizes the advances made on gender equality and the fight against harmful practices. However, much needs to be done. Establishing and ensuring respect for the rule of law is one of the prerequisites for human rights improvement. We would be interested to hear the views of the Special Rapporteur on how Eritrea and the international community could build on advances made on women's rights to other areas of human rights obligations. We appreciate the government of Eritrea's readiness to engage in bilateral dialogues on human rights. We strongly encourage Eritrea to cooperate closely with the UN on capacity building and reform in order to achieve the SDGs, including the human rights target. Norway would reiterate its recommendation that Eritrea should invite UNHCR to establish an office in the country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. We continue with Belgium.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kitarut, Belgium wishes to thank you for the recent report submitted to Council, and we commend you for the work that you've done in recent years, particularly regarding the difficult conditions given Eritrea's lack of cooperation. Belgium shares your concerns at the absence of progress in the human rights situation in the country. Your report indicates that there's still a very high number of human rights violations, such as arrests and arbitrary detention, and massive violations of freedom of expression, of association and peaceful assembly for citizens. Furthermore, the absence of parliament and the lack of independence of the justice system remain major barriers to the development of a rule of law in the country. Belgium would urge Eritrea to seize the historic opportunity of the new dynamism in the region to put an end to this situation and to take prompt, specific action to respect and protect human rights. The end of the practice of indefinite conscription should be one of the very first steps taken. Belgium views the development of human rights dialogue with some international partners with interest. Nevertheless, it calls on Eritrea to also take multilateral action and to undertake full effective cooperation with regional and international mechanisms, including OHCHR, special procedures and the treaty bodies. While we wait these specific steps to be taken, the Council will continue to closely monitor the human rights situation in Eritrea because it is necessary to continue this monitoring. Ms. Kitarouk, could you possibly elaborate on the potential role of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to support efforts to improve the human rights situation in the country? Thank you.
Your Excellency, and I pass the floor to Switzerland.
Thank you, President. Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur for her commitment during her mandate. Switzerland regrets the fact that the Special Rapporteur never had access to Eritrea and calls upon the government to cooperate with her successor. For Switzerland, the intention of Asmara to engage in dialogue with Addis Ababa is a positive sign. Such a step can only be beneficial for the human rights situation and for stability in the region. In parallel, Switzerland continues to be concerned about the grave human rights violations which are reported. We reiterate our availability to pursue dialogue and to cooperate with the United Nations agencies and mechanisms, as well as with Eritrea, with a view to improving the human rights situation. In this context, we welcome the active commitment of Eritrea to ensure follow-up to the UPR recommendations that Eritrea accepted, and we hope that concrete progress could soon be seen. However, we recall the fact that it is vital to guarantee free and independent access to the country to allow for verification of the human rights situation. In particular, Switzerland calls upon Eritrea to cooperate with the special procedures which are complementary to the Universal Periodic Review. Special Rapporteur, in your report, you recommend to Eritrea to issue a standing invitation to the special procedures. Which do you believe are the special procedures which should conduct a visit as a priority? Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland, and we continue with Djibouti.
Thank you, Mr. President. Djibouti would like to welcome Ms. Kitarouk and would also like to thank her for her reports on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, including her last one. My delegation wishes to recall that since the establishment of his mandate in 2012, the Special Rapporteur has spared no effort in creating a frank, sincere and impartial space of exchange based on non-stigmatization and non-politicization. Her successive reports to this Council have made it possible, despite the difficult circumstances created by the denial and the non-cooperation of Eritrea, to collect relevant information on human rights violations in the country. In addition, Djibouti reiterates its deep concern about the findings of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea, that it has reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed since 1991. It is regrettable that the government of Eritrea continues to fail in its international human rights and humanitarian law obligations by failing to respect the various relevant resolutions of the UN organs, including mandates of the Human Rights Council. Djibouti subscribes to the recommendation made by the Special Rapporteur in her report concerning the Eritrean government, in particular to put an end, in particular the call to put an end to the serious, systematic and widespread violation of human rights that have been denounced, and to release immediately and without conditions all those who are illegally and arbitrarily detained, including the remaining 13 Djiboutian prisoners of war who are detained incommunicado. Finally, during this session, my delegation with Somalia will present a resolution on the situation of human rights in Eritrea to extend the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and to give an opportunity to Eritrea to engage with the new Rapporteur. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam. And next speaker on my list is Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for her presentation and for her final report on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We also thank the Special Rapporteur for her service. At the outset, we welcome Eritrea's decision to send a delegation to Ethiopia to discuss resolving boundary issues. We urge timely progress in this matter as a catalyst for normalizing relations with Ethiopia and ceasing open-ended military service programs. We also welcome the government of Eritrea's progress in engaging on business and human rights as a component of its economic development and encourage it to do so within regulatory structures that are transparent, participatory and non-discriminatory. We also welcome reports that journalists have been able to enter Eritrea. Australia regrets the government of Eritrea's lack of cooperation with the Special Rapporteur, and we repeat our previous calls on the government to implement the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry's May 2016 report. We note the Special Rapporteur's conclusion that the human rights situation in Eritrea remains complex and that efforts are required to improve institutions, respect rule of law, and implement meaningful reforms. With a view to improving the situation on the ground, we would welcome more information from the Special Rapporteur on the concrete benchmarks to support tangible progress set out in her report. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I pass the floor to Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sudan welcomes the recent positive development between Eritrea and Ethiopia. One of the most important reasons for the establishment of the Council is to eliminate the lack of transparency, non-selectivity and double standards. Experience has confirmed that the mandate imposed on states do not achieve the desired goals and are contrary to the principle of the work of the Council, threats the principle of sovereignty of the states and principle of international cooperation in achieving of objectives of the Charter of United Nations, including the protection of human rights. Sudan commends the engagement of Eritrea with regional and international human rights instruments and presented the initial and combined report on the African Charter for Peoples and Human Rights in May 2018. Sudan appreciates the cooperation of Eritrea with Universal Periodic Report review mechanism in submission of the second national report and encourage Eritrea to continue national efforts to address the challenges that it faces in the development and promotion of human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you very much. Netherlands is next on our list.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to add the following remarks in our national capacity. We thank Special Rapporteur Ms. Roth for her report and express our sincere gratitude for her efforts to fulfill her mandate in the past years. The human rights situation in Eritrea shows no improvement and remains ground for serious concern. The Netherlands is particularly worried about the continued practice of indefinite national service, of arbitrary detentions, the absence of a valid constitution and rule of law, and the absence of freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. It is essential that the human rights situation in Eritrea is assessed independently. We therefore urge the government of Eritrea to cooperate with and allow access to the Special Rapporteur and other human rights mechanisms. Moreover, the Netherlands is greatly concerned by practices outside of Eritrea, and we call on Eritrea to refrain from the use of coercion, fraud and illicit means to collect taxes and other contributions outside of Eritrea from its nationals and other individuals of Eritrean descent. We also call on Eritrea to immediately stop demanding Eritreans in the diaspora to sign the so-called regret forms, forcing the acceptance of responsibility for any crime if committed before leaving the country. It is recalled that this is not admissible under the rule of law. No one is to be held guilty of a charge unless this guilt has been established by a competent court. Ms. Roth, we would like to ask if you could elaborate on possible avenues for states and other actors to support human rights in Eritrea, for example, in the area of accountability. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker is Spain.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Spain entirely endorses the statement made by the European Union. We wish to thank the rapporteur for the work that she's done throughout her mandate, and we share her concern at the human rights situation in Eritrea, which she portrays in the most recent report. The institutions are weak in the country. They need to be stronger, and there's also a need for the government and its officials to be law-abiding. This has meant we've seen an exodus of very many Eritreans, including unaccompanied minors. They abandon their country seeking refuge in neighboring countries or in Europe. There are arbitrary arrests, including of children, women and the elderly, and this is of grave concern to us. The generalized use of preventive detention worsens conditions in prisons, and we often see the deaths of detainees in custody. We're also concerned at attacks against the freedom of expression, of belief and freedom of assembly. We're also concerned at the seizure of land occupied by ethnic minorities and seizures which are carried out in a lawless fashion, and we're concerned at the condition of women in the country. We believe that the government has made improvements, but it must continue to work. These human rights violations must stop, and there must be cooperation from the government with United Nations mechanisms and with special procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. As the next speaker, I recognize Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Kitarouth, for her report and presentation, and commend her strenuous effort and dedication, as well as her high quality of work. We express our deep concern on the human rights situation in Eritrea and the noted negative trends in the area of the rule of law. Lack of meaningful progress in violations in critical areas such as freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly and freedom of religion or belief remain worrisome. Greece adds its voice to all those that have called the government of Eritrea to pay heed to the Special Rapporteur's recommendations and to proceed to all suggested actions in order to improve the situation of human rights in the country. We also urge the government of Eritrea to fully respect the land and property rights, including those of the foreign communities. Greece would like to remind that last year the real estate property of the Greek community in Asmara, which houses the offices of the Honorary Consulate General of Greece, was confiscated by Eritrean authorities. This confiscation that still pertains constitutes a blatant violation of international law and the Vienna Convention of Consular Relations of 1963. We call upon the government of Eritrea to return this real estate to its lawful owners. Finally, we welcome some efforts by Eritrean authorities to engage on human rights at both the UN level and the regional level, as well as for accepting visits by the Office of the High Commissioner. We call on the government to fully cooperate with all UN mechanisms, including by respecting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, which should be renewed, and granting to the mandate holder full and unhindered access to the country. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you very much. Next speaker is Tunisia. I see that they are absent, and we continue with New Zealand. New Zealand, absent. Venezuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President. Venezuela does not support and will oppose any country-specific action against developing countries, particularly when these mandates don't enjoy the acceptance of the concerned country. We believe that these are ways for the mandate to ensure that this body is used as a tool against sovereign countries, and they do nothing for human rights on the ground. We have to promote cooperation by means of a fair dialogue between countries. We must ensure that there is protection, and Eritrea has worked for the human rights of its people. They have been through 2 UPR cycles, and the recommendations accepted by Eritrea must be supported. Country-specific mandates violate the principle of sovereign countries and are an interference in the domestic affairs of the state, the respect of which is enshrined in the UN Charter. We once again reiterate the urgent need for this Council to abide by its mandate to protect human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, strictly abiding by the principle of universality and without resorting to selectivity, forced action, double standards by imposing these mandates against countries. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. And next on my list is China.
Mr. President, the Chinese delegation takes note of the Special Rapporteur's presentation. China always advocates for constructive dialogue and cooperation to address the differences in the area of human rights. The international community should recognize the progress and achievement by Eritrea in promoting and protecting human rights. China calls on the international community to adopt a comprehensive, impartial and objective view on the human rights situation in the country and provide constructive assistance for capacity building for human rights according to her wishes and needs. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam. And now I'll invite Mrs. Kitterud to respond to the questions and comments made at this stage. Mrs. Kitterud, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying that as I finish these 6 years, it would have been my preferred mode of gathering information and engaging with Eritrea through dialogue, and constructive one. And I have made several overtures to that effect. Unfortunately, I haven't been invited to the country, and other means of engaging with the country has met with all sorts of obstacles. It hasn't been for a lack of wanting that mode of engagement. That's the first point which I would like to really clarify, and it's also a point which I think needs to be understood. I can't go to the country if I'm not invited. And if there is no invitation to me to the mandate as a creation of the Council, then I consider that already to be some kind of non-cooperation with a mandate which the Council created. Having said that, I would like to quickly just go through some of the issues which have been raised. I take the issue of women's rights first of all. I think there has been progress in that field, and I agree with that. However, the violations in the context of women in the national service persist. I still do have reports about sexual violence in the national service, which is still in effect, one. The other aspect, yes, education is available to all women, but there are hidden discrimination which happens. I'd like to take one of them and explain. While education is available to everyone, lots of families have taken their own, what they call, coping measures with regards to women in the national service. Many do not. So when they reach, for example, the 11th grade, before going to the 12th grade where they all go for military training, lots of families have resorted to having their girls remain in their own communities, and they become invisible. They then don't get the skills to be able to raise to higher paid jobs and other kinds of higher level education. While it is open, there still are other areas which still need to be looked into. That's a point with regards to education. Also ensuring, I'll take my report this time deals specifically with arrest and detention and prison conditions. Women and children in the context of detention face very difficult circumstances, while again, prison conditions across Eritrea are dire and really very bad. Their impact, the negative impact on women, they feel it even more. And the case of death in detention, several death in detentions that I've mentioned, are very important in that kind of a situation. Also, yes, there are progress, but we still need to hear more. The other point, I know from my research that there has been progress in banning FGM, for example. However, we need more information and we need more data, which should be available, and also with regards to, first of all, the prosecutions. There is a law, of course, but we need to hear more with regards to the number of prosecutions, what has happened, and what has been progress. Sharing of data is very important in different fields, and I think what is out there is useful, the data which is there is useful, but they need to be more transparent and more desegregated. I could go on with regards to women's rights. Yes, there has been progress, but what is more important there is that to advance women's rights in Eritrea, there has been the political will. Whereas to transfer that political will to other civil and political rights and other economic and social rights is what is lacking at this particular moment in time. And why is that important? And this is what we need to learn in terms of how this political will can transform the human rights environment. First of all, and this links to the benchmarks, the question about benchmarks, which has been asked. First of all, where is the constitution of Eritrea? That's the founding law on which the political will would be built with regards to showing that indeed there is a will to transfer this political will to other areas. The constitution is one, the laws, the frameworks, also with regards to the specific issues around the progress to be made with regards to the institutions, parliament, open space for civil society, for diverse political parties, etc. These are benchmarks which I have noted previously, which I have detailed in my last report, and which I mentioned in this particular instance also with regards to some of the recommendations I make. So that's really this, the whole issue about the political will, which needs to be transferred, the lessons learned from women's rights, the advancement of women's rights, into other areas, which will in fact then bring that transformation and change in the human rights landscape. That's one of the things which I thought was important, and of course the rule of law. There are laws, there are documents, there are penal codes, civil code, etc. They need to be respected. Independence of the judiciary needs to be guaranteed. These are benchmarks, and this also show the political will to change. I'll come now to the role of broadly about regional organizations, but also other mandates and and other mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. To that I will also add the whole issue around the engagement with the UPR, which is very important. Creation of the Council, very important in terms of reviewing the human rights situation. But human rights organizations, regional, global, as well as other mechanisms, are complementary. one cannot pick and choose. One can't say we would want to engage solely with one particular one and not with others. There needs to be openness to review the current and ongoing human rights context. So the openness to engage with all human rights mechanisms without picking and choosing. So with that, I will respond to one of the questions which was posed, which would be, for example, the most pressing mechanisms which should visit the country. I believe the working group on arbitrary detentions is a first which needs to be given the opportunity to visit the country. There's also freedom of religion and belief. This is one of the issues which has come up very strongly in my research over the past 2 years for all religious groups in Eritrea. A pair of eyes which specifically go into the details of how that right is enjoyed in Eritrea would be very useful to all, but more specifically also to the Council and to Eritreans. The other one would be freedom of expression. I have counted over the past since I've been in this position, 90 journalists have been arrested. Of course, some have been, released, but there are still who are in incommunicado detention till this very day. You may ask me, how did I reach a figure like 90? It is not exhaustive, but what I did was sit down and write each and every name I have been able to document, have had this list verified and cross-checked, triangulated from several angles. So, even though this figure is incomplete and doesn't show the exact situation, it is very alarming. Freedom of expression, a free press and all that, so that mandate is important. The other one would be freedom of association and peaceful association and peaceful assembly. We have seen over the past few months how people have been arrested for protesting peacefully. So these are some of the ones which I would say urgently need to visit. I would now come to the role of regional organizations. There is a cooperation between mandates at those at the global level and regional ones through for Africa what has been named as the Addis Ababa Roadmap. So it is on the basis of that roadmap that different mandates cooperate. And I commend Eritrea for having gone to, first of all, the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child for their review, and last April to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I think there is a complementarity role which is played here and which is very important. The regional organizations have a relationship of proximity with the countries in the region from Africa. We also have lots of work with regards to different mandates and with also the cooperation with our mandates at the global level, at the UN level, plus the regional level, and having the opportunity of an organization like the African Commission review rights contained in the African Charter, which are quite the sort of things we also do in our own mandate. For example, the arbitrary arrest and detention, right to life, freedom of expression, assembly, etc., from different angles is useful for the advancement and enjoyment of human rights. I have unfortunately no information at all with regards to the remaining 13 Djiboutian prisoners of war. I have tried to obtain this information. I still have not been successful in obtaining information about them. Concrete benchmarks from Australia, I've responded to that. They are found in my last report also, a long list of all the benchmarks. I make a few references in this particular report, in the recommendations also. And also I would like to respond with regards to accountability, which states measures states could take to advance accountability. The Commission of Inquiry found that there was reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed in Eritrea. So, on the basis of that, since last year, having been tasked with following up on the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry, I have embarked on engaging with different actors to explore accountability routes. Universal jurisdiction, which I deal with in my 2017 report, is one of them. There are other areas also, different ways of making sure that people have access to justice when in the face of human rights violations. Also, to say that it is really unfortunate that Eritrea has shown that victims of crimes against humanity and human rights violations are not able to get adequate remedies in Eritrea. That should have been the first place where they get justice, where they obtain justice and access justice and remedies. Unfortunately, deep-rooted impunity persists, with the prospect that perpetrators will continue to be shielded. So this is why the pursuit of justice and accountability at other levels, including through universal jurisdiction, which is a long-term process that requires sustained advocacy and efforts from all, needs to continue. I'm happy to continue, but I think there are other questions.
That's correct. Well, thank you very much, Madam Special Rapporteur, for these explanations and replies. And we shall now return to our list of speakers. Next on my list is United Kingdom. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Kingdom would like to thank the Special Rapporteur, Ms. Kita Ruth, for her report and also for her efforts over the past 6 years. We urge the Government of Eritrea to make renewed efforts to engage with any new successor Special Rapporteur. Mr. President, Eritrea remains a priority country for the United Kingdom's engagement on human rights. As such, we renew our call for the Government of Eritrea to reform the national service system, to implement the Constitution, to respect freedom of religion or belief, and to release all those in arbitrary detention. As such, we will strongly support inclusion of these issues in this session's resolution on the human rights situation in Eritrea. The United Kingdom supports the Special Rapporteur's statement of 3rd of May this year on press freedom in Eritrea. We call for the release of or completion of due process for journalists in detention in Eritrea and the lifting of impositions on the free press. Finally, Mr. President, we would like to ask the Special Rapporteur what advice she would offer for her successor on building a constructive relationship with the Government of Eritrea and the key priorities moving forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you very much. Next speaker is Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. We bring our greetings to Special Rapporteur Sheila Kita-Root and take good note of the recent report. We welcome the positive developments that we've seen in relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Renewed contact between the two countries is very promising in order to fully implement the Algiers Accord and the conclusions of the Border Commission. We very much hope that this will have a positive outcome when it comes to the promotion of human rights, notably in Eritrea. We would urge the international community to support these confidence-building measures and to make sure that Eritrea has all the technical assistance which it requires. The third UPR for Eritrea planned for 2019 should provide a further opportunity for cooperation and constructive dialogue between our Council and Eritrea. Thank you.
I pass the floor to Belarus.
Господин председатель.
President, country procedures in the United Nations Human Rights Council are not the most effective institution to make a constructive contribution to promoting and protecting human rights. From this point of view, we also assess the mandate on Eritrea as not being effective. Created with an absence of universally approved criteria and without the agreement of the government concerned, such mandates are doomed to failure from the outset. And a lack of possibilities to cooperate with the government or to visit the country means that these mandates are not capable of objectively evaluating the situation on the ground. Given this, they are forced to resort to remote monitoring, which we believe is of no practical value whatsoever, and the contents of the reports prepared on the basis of remote monitoring, to put it mildly, cannot stand up to any criticism. These reports should be looked at with great prudence, and the facts in them should be checked painstakingly. We consistently state that it is only through a mutually respectful dialogue and cooperation with the government concerned that it is possible to achieve more progress in promoting and protecting human rights. The methods of pressure and monitoring that some are attempting to promote within the Council are not able to produce practical results. We would suggest that with Eritrea, as with other states, the right conditions for a mutually respectful dialogue are present in the Universal Periodic Review. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We continue with Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
President, we regret that the Special Rapporteur's report has not been made available in all official languages. As has always been our position, we reiterate that Cuba is not in favor of involving the Security Council on human rights issues because it's not part of the mandate of this body. Involving the Security Council means in practice that a punitive approach is applied in finding solutions to the issues being dealt with, which reduces or indeed eliminates the possibilities of finding more constructive, feasible opportunities to foster international cooperation, technical assistance, and the support that countries that are in a position to do so can offer. Cuba believes that the Human Rights Council must not refuse to explore and promote new opportunities for cooperation and dialogue with Eritrea. This must be done in a climate of mutual understanding, respectful exchange, confidence and transparency. These are essential for promoting true international cooperation and to make real progress when it comes to the promotion and protection of human rights for all. Cuba is convinced that cooperation and dialogue must have primacy when we tackle human rights situations that require our concern and the support of the international community. We believe that we must foster an understanding of different realities and we must identify the challenges in order to bear in mind everybody's concerns. It will only be in this way that measures can be effective and can truly contribute to promoting and protecting human rights of those people that need them. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Next on my list is Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We carefully read through the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We would note again that the examination of Eritrea as a subject in the Human Rights Council leads to a politicized discussion and cannot facilitate improvements in the human rights situation in the country. We are against such an approach. We repeat our position that human rights situations in individual countries must be examined exclusively in a constructive manner, with the fully fledged participation of the state concerned. The best platform for this is the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. Once again, we would emphasise that pursuant to Resolution 60/251, establishing the HRC, the Council is a mechanism for international human rights cooperation, and this is equal, mutually respectful and constructive cooperation which should be the foundation of the Council's work. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. France, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you very much, President. France fully aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and we thank the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Eritrea for her presentation and for all of the work that she has done since the mandate was established 6 years ago. France remains concerned at the human rights situation in Eritrea. The conclusions of the Special Rapporteur in the most recent report show that there are human rights violations which are ongoing in the country. This includes arrests and arbitrary detention, attacks on freedom of expression, or violations connected to indefinite military service. We would urge the Eritrean authorities to put in place the Special Rapporteur's recommendations and those made during its recent Universal Periodic Review. France notes the positive dialogue that the Eritrean authorities have had with OHCHR and would urge the country to continue down this path. We must now make sure that these exchanges are translated into effective improvement in the human rights situation on the ground. The Human Rights Council must continue to monitor the situation in Eritrea, and for this reason France supports the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the country. We would urge the Eritrean authorities to fully cooperate with the new mandate holder, particularly by guaranteeing unhindered access to the country. I thank you, President.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I wish to thank Mrs. Kitarut and all of you for participating and for your contributions at this dialogue. Lastly, Mrs. Ketarut, as your term as a Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea will be coming to an end, I wish to take this opportunity to express, on behalf of the Council, our deep appreciation for the valuable contributions you have made to the work of the Council and wish you all the best in your future endeavours.